We will talk about pacemakers today. Just a quick reminder of the cardiac conduction system. We generally have the patient start at the SA node, spread across the atria, reach that AV node, get to the bundle of His where it goes into the right and left bundle branches down into the Purkinje fibers of the ventricles. We do have three pacemakers within our heart. The first one is the SA node. When that fails, we have a backup pacemaker of the AV node. When that fails, we finally have a pacemaker down in the ventricles. But what happens if that fails? The next option is a pacemaker. So just some terminology that we can cover. When we talk about pacemakers that are in demand, it is that guaranteed minimum rate fires only when it is sensed in any electrical activity in the heart. So this is like on demand, only needed at certain times. Asynchronous, on the other hand, is a fixed rate. It'll fire at a preset rate despite the intrinsic rhythm, and it does not sense. If we want to look at the pacing kind of broken down, this is atrial pacing. So with atrial pacing, you are going to see that spike right before that P wave here. Ventricular pacing, on the other hand, will have the spike right before the QRS. And it tends to make kind of a widened QRS similar to a PVC or a bundle branch block. AV pacing, you're going to see two spikes. So you will see a spike right before the P wave and then a spike right before the ventricular. If you do have a patient with a biventricular pacemaker, oftentimes you will see a second spike by that QRS. Sometimes it's negatively deflected, or you just see a second spike positively deflected by that ventricular. The NBG code is utilized when you want to know what the patient's device is set to do. It's set in 5 categories. The first category would be the chamber's pace. Is it the atrium? Is it the ventricle? Or is it both? The second one would be the chamber's sensed. And that can sense the intrinsic rhythms from both chambers, even if one is only set to pace. It starts a timer for it. The third category is response to sensing, and the response to sensing is that the inhibited allows the pacer to withhold that output in a sensed event. Rate modulation. With rate modulation, basically provides the patient with the ability to vary heart rates between the programmed lower rates and the upper sensed chambers. Multi-site pacing is rarely used, so we won't talk about that one. As a reminder, holding a magnet over a pacer will turn off the sensing mechanism, and the pacer will pace asynchronously, meaning it'll continuously pace at a set rate. Sensitivity is the amount of millivolts needed to inhibit the pacemaker. We consider it a wall here. If the heart had eyes, it would sit behind that wall where it could visualize or not visualize what the patient's heart is actually doing. If that sensitivity wall is set correctly, then the patient will have the pacemaker only fire if needed. As you can see in this example here, we are ventricularly pacing. We've got the ventricular pace spike followed by that widened QRS. And then here we go back to the intrinsic rhythm of a sinus rhythm. So the patient did not need any assistance with a pacemaker on those final 2 beats. But sometimes that wall can be set a little bit too high. So you remember I said the heart had eyes. So if the heart had eyes and the fence was too high, it's going to be unable to basically sense what is going on around them. So what happens is the pacemaker basically does its own thing and it fires too asynchronously. We call that undersensing. Remember that the wall is too high, and so therefore the heart is unable to kind of sense what is going on around them. So because that wall is too high, you're going to get a lot of extra spikes with that asynchronous. As you can see here, we do have ventricular pacing, followed by what looks like an intrinsic beat here, and another ventricular pacing, but we've got this where it's a little bit out of synchronous of what it should be. On the opposite, we have oversensing. So now that wall is set too low. So if I have my heart with eyes, it basically can see everything. So it's significantly oversensitive. So any beat that has 2 millivolts or more will be viewed as if it were activity. So this comes into play when you've got somebody that has a lot of artifact, or maybe they're utilizing a razor, a lot of activity, their stickers aren't on right, where it can pick up activity that assumes is a heartbeat when it is not. So what happens is, unfortunately, we don't get enough pacer spikes. So here's an example of that oversensing here. We probably should have had a little bit of help here, a little bit of help here, but because it was oversensitive and that wall was set too low, that it considered some of this artifact as actual beats. Some other malfunctions that can happen is we can have failure to capture. So we do get that pacing spike, but it's not followed by a P or a QRS. So you can see here that we have some good ventricular pace beats, but now I have a pacer spike here with no activity after that. So sometimes this can be related to the heart being sick. It can be a lot of different things. It can be related to acidosis, some electrolyte imbalances, but you just need to know that we have a spike, not followed by a QRS after that. Another malfunction that can happen is failure to pace. So the heart may be okay, but maybe the pacer has lost its electrical activity, or the battery has died, or maybe a lead has been fractured. So what you guys will see is have some activity here, and then there's nothing here. So we don't have any atrial or ventricular activity intrinsically or from the pacemaker itself. Just a couple reminders when we think about the magnet. So this magnet is located in all of the crash carts on the bottom. Some units do have them outside of the crash cart that utilize it a little bit more frequently. But the two things to think about, if I were to put a magnet on a pacemaker, it will pace them asynchronous, meaning at a set rate, it's going to pace them at maybe 70 beats per minute. We use this a lot for battery testing or pacer-mediated tachycardia. ICDs, on the other hand, if we utilize the magnet, it's going to disable that device. You can see there's a clear difference between the two. You might see this with a no-code blue patient, death and dying patient, or utilized in the perioperative services.